"I need a wife by tomorrow," said the mountain man. The words fell into the smoky warmth of the saloon like stones into a still pond, heavy and disruptive. Every gambler, trapper, and weary soul nursing a drink turned to look. He filled the doorway, a figure so immense he seemed to block out the very memory of the winter afternoon outside. His hair and beard were a wild, dark tangle frosted with snow. His shoulders were a testament to a life spent wrestling with the wilderness, and his deerskin coat was worn smooth with use. He was a creature of the mountains, raw and untamed, and his presence made the civilized confines of the room feel fragile. Laughter trickled through the silence first, a low, ugly sound from a card table. It grew, swelling into a chorus of ridicule. The man in the doorway didn't flinch. His gaze, a startlingly clear blue in the weathered landscape of his face, swept over the room, unblinking and desperate. Then his eyes found her. An Lee stood behind the long, polished bar, a still point in the swirling currents of noise and mockery. She wore a dress of dark, watered silk, the color of dried blood, its quiet elegance a stark contrast to her surroundings. At 25, she was the sole proprietor of the Gilded Cage, a saloon she had built from a ruin into the town's beating heart. She ran it with a quiet authority that no one dared to challenge. She had seen countless men in this room, proud men, broken men, cruel men, and foolish men, but she had never seen a look like the one in this giant's eyes. It was not the simple need of a lonely man or the arrogance of a boastful one. It was something deeper, a raw, hollowed-out pain that seemed to echo a wound she carried deep within herself. The sight of it silenced the world, and for a long, breathless moment, the laughter of the room faded into a distant hum. In his eyes, she saw the terrifying clarity of a man standing on the edge of a cliff, with no way back and only one impossible path forward. And the recognition of that desperation broke something in her. The jeers grew louder, more pointed. "Hear that, boys? The bear wants a bride," one man cackled, slapping his knee. "What's the matter, Reese? Your old woman run off?" another shouted, his face red with cheap whiskey. The mountain man, Reese, remained motionless, his jaw set like granite. His gaze never left An Lee, a silent, drowning plea. An Lee felt a familiar coil of anger tighten in her chest. These men drank her whiskey and warmed themselves by her fire, yet their casual cruelty was a constant, simmering threat. She placed both hands flat on the bar, the sound a soft but definitive thud that cut through the noise. "That's enough," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that made the room fall silent again. The men grumbled, turning back to their cards and their drinks, but the venom had gone out of the air. An Lee wiped down a clean section of the bar with a cloth, her movements deliberate and calm. She beckoned him forward with a small, sharp nod. Reese moved with a surprising grace for a man his size, his worn boots making little sound on the floorboards. He stopped before her, his massive frame dwarfing the bar. Up close, the scent of pine and cold, clean air clung to him. The lines around his eyes were etched deep, not just from sun and wind, but from a sorrow that seemed to have settled into his very bones. "Whiskey?" she asked, her tone even. He shook his head. "I told you what I need." His voice was a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. "And I'm prepared to pay." He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and placed a small, heavy deerskin bag on the counter. The clink was not of coin, but of something more substantial. Gold. "That's for her trouble, and I've got a claim that'll keep her comfortable for the rest of her days." An Lee didn't look at the gold. She kept her eyes on his. "Why?" she asked, the single word cutting to the heart of it. "Why tomorrow?" A muscle worked in his jaw. "It's a deadline, a legal matter." The hesitation told her it was more than that. It was personal. "There are women in this town who would take your gold for a night," she said, her voice dropping lower. But a wife is a different thing. He finally broke eye contact, his gaze falling to his own large, calloused hands resting on the bar. "It has to be a wife," he said, the words raw with frustration. "It has to be real, on paper, before the circuit judge leaves the valley day after tomorrow." An-Li untied her apron and hung it on a hook beneath the bar. "Follow me," she commanded softly, turning toward a door behind the counter. Reese hesitated for a moment, then followed her out of the main room and into the quiet of her small office. The room was sparse but orderly. A small desk, a single chair for a visitor, and a shelf of ledgers. A window looked out onto a narrow alley where the snow was piling in clean, silent drifts. The sounds of the saloon were muffled here, distant and unimportant. She lit an oil lamp, and the warm glow pushed back the encroaching twilight, casting their shadows long and stark against the wall. She motioned for him to take the chair, but he remained standing, as if he were too large and untamed for such a small, civilized space. "Now," An-Li said, leaning against the edge of her desk, her arms crossed, "tell me the truth, not the part about the law, the part that put that look in your eyes." For a long time he said nothing. He stared at the floor, his great shoulders slumped, the weight of his impossible request pressing down on him. She waited, her patience a tangible thing in the quiet room. She had learned long ago that silence could pry open doors that force could never breach. Finally he spoke, his voice thick with unshed grief. "I had a sister, Elspeth. She was all I had left." He swallowed hard. "She took ill this past autumn, fast, before I could get back down from my high trapping line. She was gone." He paused, the memory clearly a physical pain. "She filed on a homestead claim, 160 acres of the most beautiful land you've ever seen, up on the South Ridge. It was her dream. She wanted to be buried there, under the pines, looking out over the valley. It was the only thing she ever asked of me." He finally looked up, and the anguish in his eyes was so profound it made An-Li's breath catch. "The claim has a proving up clause, a settlement clause. To be finalized, the deed holder has to be part of a family unit, married. The deadline is tomorrow at sundown. If I'm not married, the land reverts to the railroad. They'll clear-cut the timber, and her final resting place will be on land that belongs to them. I cannot let that happen. It was a promise." The story settled in the small room, filling the space between them. A promise to the dead. An-Li felt the truth of it in her soul. This wasn't about property. It was about sanctuary. It was about a brother's guilt and his desperate, loving penance. The word promise snagged on a memory deep inside her, a memory she kept locked away. She thought of her own journey, the flight from her home across the ocean. She had been promised too. Promised in marriage to a wealthy merchant in her homeland, a man old enough to be her grandfather, a man with cruel hands and emptier eyes. Her family had seen it as a great honor, a way to secure their future. They could not see the cage he was building for her. So she had run. She had taken the money saved for her dowry and booked passage on a ship, leaving behind a letter that she knew would break her mother's heart. She had never known if they forgave her. She only knew that the freedom she had found here, in this harsh, unforgiving land, was a freedom she had to build for herself, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. This saloon, the Gilded Cage, was more than a business. It was her fortress, the proof that she belonged to no one but herself. She understood Reese's desperation to protect a piece of land, because her own small kingdom of liquor bottles and worn card tables was just as sacred. It was the physical manifestation of her own vow to remain free. To help him would mean binding herself, even on paper, to a man. It went against every instinct that had kept her safe for the past 7 years, and yet To refuse felt like a betrayal of the very spirit that had driven her here, the belief that some things, like a promise to a dying sister or the right to own your own soul, were worth fighting for. She looked at him, at this wild man of the mountain, and she did not see a threat. She saw a fellow guardian, a protector of a legacy, just as she was. His battle was for a grave on a hill. Hers was for the right to stand behind this bar, unbeholden to any man. Perhaps their paths were not so different after all. An-Li pushed herself off the desk, her decision made. The rustle of her silk dress was the only sound. "I will do it," she said. The relief that washed over Reese's face was so immense it was almost painful to watch. The tension went out of his shoulders, and he seemed to shrink slightly, becoming less of a mountain and more of a man. He reached for the bag of gold again, pushing it across the desk toward her. "Thank you. I don't have the words." An-Li placed her hand over his, stopping him. His skin was rough and cold, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "This is not about your gold," she said, her voice firm. "Keep it. You'll need it for the homestead. But there are conditions." "My conditions?" He nodded immediately, his eyes earnest. "Anything." She drew a deep breath, laying out the terms of her own survival. "First, this is a contract. We will be married before the judge, and you will secure the deed to your sister's land. That is the beginning and the end of our arrangement." She watched his face for any sign of argument, but he only listened, his expression solemn. "Second, this saloon remains mine. My name stays on the deed, and my life here remains my own. I will not be moving to your mountain. I will not be your wife in any way but on that piece of paper. This is a business transaction to honor a promise, nothing more." He nodded again, slower this time. A flicker of something, disappointment perhaps, passed through his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I understand," he said. "Your life is your own. I would not ask for more." "Good," she said, pulling her hand back. "Then we have an agreement. We should leave now if we're to reach the circuit judge's office in Miller's Hollow by morning." He looked startled. "Now? But your saloon—" "My man Thomas can manage for a day," she replied, already moving toward the door. "Go and get your horse. I'll meet you out back in 10 minutes. I just need a heavy coat." He stood there for a moment, seemingly unable to process the speed of it all, the sheer reality of this stranger's sudden, conditional grace. "Miss, I don't even know your name." She paused at the door, looking back at him over her shoulder. "An-Li," she said. "My name is An-Li." Then she was gone, leaving him alone in the quiet warmth of the office, the lamplight flickering on the bag of gold he had offered and she had refused. The journey up the mountain was a passage into a different world. The last lights of the town vanished behind them, swallowed by the thick, falling snow. The world became a simple, stark palette of white and gray. Reese led the way, his broad back a dark shape against the snow-laden pines. He broke the trail for her mare, moving with a steady, relentless rhythm that spoke of a lifetime spent in this terrain. An-Li followed, huddled deep in her borrowed wool coat, the cold a sharp, biting thing that seeped into her bones. They did not speak. The air was too cold for words, and there was nothing left to say. Their contract had been made, their purpose set. Now there was only the climb. The silence was profound, broken only by the muffled crunch of hooves in the fresh powder and the whisper of the wind through the high branches. An-Li watched Reese, studying the way he moved, the way he navigated the trail with an instinct that was more animal than human. He was a part of this place. The mountain was in his blood. As they climbed higher, the trees thinned, and the landscape opened up into vast, breathtaking vistas of snow-covered peaks under a sky thick with clouds. It was a beautiful and terribly lonely world. She thought of the woman Elspeth, who had dreamed of making a home here. It would take a will of iron to survive in such a place. Anneli shivered, and it wasn't entirely from the cold. She was a creature of walls and roofs, of the close, human warmth of her saloon. This endless, silent wilderness felt like another kind of cage, one with no visible bars but just as confining. The hours blurred together. The physical exertion of the ride, the relentless cold, and the sheer strangeness of her situation left her in a state of weary detachment. She was no longer Anneli, the saloon owner. She was a woman in a red dress, following a giant through a storm to become his wife in name only, all to protect a dead woman's grave. The absurdity of it was a cold knot in her stomach. Yet, whenever she felt a tremor of fear or regret, she would look at Reese's back. It was a steady, unwavering shield against the storm, and she found a strange, unexpected comfort in its presence. He was a man bound by a promise, and in that moment, that felt like the most reliable thing in the entire world. They arrived just as the last of the day's light was failing, turning the snow a deep, bruised purple. The cabin was nestled in a grove of ancient pines, small and dark against the vastness of the white landscape. It was a simple structure of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney from which a thin curl of smoke was rising. Someone had been keeping the fire alive for him. The sight of it, a small beacon of warmth in the immense cold, made Anneli's tired body ache with relief. Reese slid from his horse and came to help her down, his large hands closing gently around her waist to lift her to the ground. Her legs were stiff and numb, and she stumbled, leaning against him for a moment. He held her steady, his strength a solid wall against the wind. "We're here," he said softly. Before taking her inside, he led her a short way from the cabin to the edge of a ridge that overlooked the entire valley below. Even in the gloom, the view was magnificent, and there, marked by a simple wooden cross, was a mound of earth kept clear of the deepest snow, a single grave. "This is her," Reese said, his voice quiet and rough with emotion. "This is Elspeth." He stood before the grave, his hat in his hands, the wind whipping his long hair around his face. He wasn't speaking to Anneli anymore. He was speaking to his sister. "I brought someone, Elspeth. I'm keeping my promise." Anneli stood a respectful distance away, a silent witness. The raw grief coming from him was a palpable force, a cold wave that had nothing to do with the winter air. She saw it all then, the desperate plea in the saloon, the urgency, the journey through the storm. It all led to this single lonely spot on a mountainside. It was a pilgrimage. She was not just a party to a contract. She was a piece of his atonement. The understanding settled deep within her, shifting the foundation of their agreement. The cold formality of her conditions, her talk of a business transaction, felt hollow and small in the face of such profound love and loss. She bowed her head, offering a silent prayer for the woman she would never know, the woman whose dream had so unexpectedly become entangled with her own. Inside, the cabin was one room, dominated by a large stone hearth where embers glowed warmly. It was rustic, but impeccably clean. A simple bed stood in one corner, a sturdy table and 2 chairs in the center. Shelves lined one wall, holding neatly stacked tins and supplies. It was a space built for solitude and survival. There was a quiet, monastic order to it. Reese added logs to the fire, and soon flames were leaping, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. The heat felt miraculous against Anneli's frozen skin. "I'm sorry it's not much," he said, his voice awkward as he took in the small space through her eyes. "It's warm," she replied, and meant it. "That's more than enough." He gestured to the bed. "You should take that. I'll sleep by the fire." She didn't argue. She was too tired. While she removed her damp coat and boots, he moved about the small space with a quiet efficiency, preparing a simple meal. He sliced bread and cheese and heated a pot of venison stew that had been simmering slowly on the hearth. They ate at the small table, the silence between them no longer strained, but filled with the comfortable sounds of the crackling fire and their own quiet exhaustion. He told her about the cabin, how he and Elspeth had built it together the summer before. He spoke of his sister's laugh, of her fierce determination to have a piece of the world that was truly hers. As he spoke, the fierce mountain man from the saloon receded, and in his place was just a brother, lost in his grief. An-Li found herself listening, truly listening, not as a business partner, but as a confidant. She saw the gentleness in his large hands as he refilled her bowl, the kindness in his eyes as he watched to make sure she was warm enough. After they ate, he cleaned their plates, his movements methodical. The simple domesticity of the act felt strangely intimate. Here, in this isolated cabin, stripped of the roles they played in the world below, they were just two people, sharing a space, a meal, a moment of quiet respite from the storm outside and the storms within. A fragile, unspoken connection began to form in the firelight, a bond woven from shared silence and a mutual respect for each other's sorrow. The next morning they rode down to Miller's Hollow, a small settlement in the valley that was little more than a trading post and the temporary office of the circuit judge. The judge was a portly man with a weary face who looked at them over his spectacles, his expression betraying no surprise. He had likely seen every kind of strange arrangement this frontier could produce. The ceremony was brief, the words clinical and devoid of romance. They signed the ledger, their names, Reese Morgan and An-Li, now legally bound together. The judge stamped the document, handed Reese the official deed to the homestead, and just like that, it was done. The promise was fulfilled. The ride back up the mountain felt different. The desperate urgency was gone, replaced by a strange, uncertain quiet. The land was his. Elspeth's final wish was secure. But now, a new question hung in the air between them. What next? Back in the warmth of the cabin, the reality of their situation settled in. The contract was complete. An-Li was, by her own terms, free to return to her life, her saloon. Reese built up the fire, his movements slow, reluctant. He stood staring into the flames for a long time before he finally turned to her. "I didn't tell you the whole truth," he said, his voice low. "It wasn't just about the land." An-Li waited, her heart beating a little faster. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "The day I left for the high country, Elspeth and I had a fight. A terrible one. She wanted me to stay, said she had a bad feeling about the winter. I called her foolish. I was angry about a poor season, and I took it out on her. The last words I ever said to my sister were cruel." He finally looked at her, his face a mask of guilt. "I found out she was sick when I came down for supplies. By the time I got back up here, she was gone. She died thinking I was angry with her, thinking I had abandoned her. So this," he gestured around the cabin, toward the window that looked out on the grave, "this promise? It was the only way I had left to tell her I was sorry. The only way I could show her I hadn't forgotten her." The confession was raw, a wound laid bare. An-Li felt a profound ache for him, for the weight of guilt he had carried alone all these months. It was a burden she understood all too well. "I also left things unsaid," she heard herself say, the words coming out before she could stop them. "I ran away from an arranged marriage. I shamed my family. I never wrote. I never looked back. I don't know if my parents are alive or dead. I tell myself I did it to be free, but some nights I wonder if I was just a coward." Their secrets were out, laid bare in the quiet cabin, and in that shared vulnerability, the last wall between them crumbled. They were no longer a mountain man and a saloon owner. They were two lonely souls, haunted by their pasts, who had stumbled upon a moment of unexpected grace. He took a hesitant step toward her, his expression soft and full of a question he didn't seem to know how to ask. The legal arrangement, the cold contract she had insisted upon, felt like a distant memory, a fiction they had both agreed to believe in. The truth was here, in this room, in the confession they had shared. He slowly reached out, not to grab or to hold, but just to touch the back of her hand with his fingertips. The contact was electric, a simple gesture that carried the weight of everything unsaid between them. It was a touch that offered comfort, asked for forgiveness, and hinted at a future that neither of them had dared to imagine. "The contract is fulfilled," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You are free to go back to your saloon, to your life. I will not hold you to anything more." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "But I find myself wishing you wouldn't." He wasn't asking her to be a wife in the traditional sense. He was asking for something far more terrifying and beautiful. He was asking her to stay, to share this quiet, this solitude, not as an obligation, but as a choice. An Li looked from his earnest, hopeful face to the fire crackling in the hearth, its warmth a steady, living presence. She looked out the small window at the single grave on the ridge, a place of sorrow that was now also a place of sanctuary. For so long, her independence had been her shield, her fortress. She had believed that to be free, she had to be alone. But in the past 2 days, this gentle giant of a man had shown her a different kind of strength, the strength to keep a promise, to bear a terrible grief, and to ask for help. He wasn't a cage. He was a harbor. A slow smile touched her lips, a small, genuine curve that reached her eyes. She didn't say yes. She didn't need to. Instead, she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. His large, rough hand enveloped hers, a perfect, secure fit. The storm outside had passed, and in the quiet aftermath, in a small cabin on a lonely mountain, 2 people who had met as strangers began the slow, tender work of building a home.